happy to be grilled, essentially. We also have other members of the Community Council here. We also have representatives of other governance structures. You see Scott, I think we have folks from, we have folks from Ubuntu. So we have quite a broad representative group in terms of governance generally and leadership generally. That, I think, is the focus of this, not general questions about anything you may be interested in Ubuntu.
Okay, so usually the way this works, I'm assuming we're going to be taking a lot of the questions from IRC, is if everybody who wants to ask a question on IRC types in the word question in capital letters. I'm going to put the questions in. Sorry? Oh, okay. So everybody who wants to ask a question on IRC, please type in question in uppercase, and I'm going to make a log of the questions, and I'll ask Mark each question, and we'll take it that way. So ask your questions.
Okay, maybe we should start out looking at responsibility and allocation of responsibility, because responsibility and accountability go together. We have a governance structure where essentially we have community council and technical board, and then we have a whole bunch of other leadership bodies and leadership individuals. For example, we have a Ubuntu council, we have an IRC council, we have ops teams, we have marketing teams, we have documentation teams, we have locos and sub-locos and regional locos and really loco-locos. And the key question, or the key goal I think we should set is that we're confident that the process by which people are appointed or approved for positions of responsibility is one we all have confidence in. It's a meritocracy, essentially. That ultimately, on balance, we feel the people within this community who have to take a particular decision are the right people to take that decision. And on the back of that, therefore, while they're accountable to us, we're not second-guessing them all the time. And that, to me, is the key thing. Like, we have to balance this idea of accountability and openness with the whole idea that anything can be second-guessed, anything can be challenged, anything becomes a vote or a debate. And to me, this is absolutely clear in the Ubuntu community, or how I think the Ubuntu community should be run, but this is an opportunity for us to discuss it or debate it. Does anybody have examples where, for example, where they think we don't get this right? Scott?
I've gotten a sense, especially in private conversation, that there's a concern about touching various things that they feel you have a personal attachment to. For instance, like revisiting the question of the notification being off from the top or up at the top, right? This was a question that was very lively in the past, and it was sort of settled, and there's a sense like we don't want to discuss it again because Mark's kind of got an opinion on it. Right?
Okay, so that's an interesting example. If it weren't me, right? But there is a design team, right? It's tightly coupled, within Canonical. Although there are many open conversations, we have more open conversations about design in our community than any other. I don't want to call them competing communities, but alternative communities. So I have no real problems with the openness there. Would you agree that a design team is a team that is likely to take controversial decisions, but that we need to be confident that they're able to take those decisions?
And what the concern that I've heard is that there's this fear that people are moving in a direction because you're the boss, right? And there's this inherent concern about like it's not that important enough to me to cause this conflict in my career or my job or my community, right? And so I have this feeling that, like, hypothetically, if all the ideas you presented came from an anonymous pseudonym, they wouldn't have the same weight, right?
Right. So I think that's probably true, and I think there's a value, though, in having an arbiter and decision maker. Sometimes it really doesn't matter whether you go left or right. It does matter whether you you know, sit and say. I remember watching a terrible scene one night around a water hole when we knew there was this huge male lion behind a bush, and this mother and Bambi came down to drink, and we knew the huge male lion was precisely 3 meters behind them both, and when the lion pounced, you don't know who to cheer for. But it turns out that Mom went one way around the water hole, Bambi went the other way around the water hole, and the dumb male lion just stopped and stared, you know, and couldn't decide who he wanted to eat. Could have eaten either, didn't eat any. And I think, you know, communities can be like that too. So I don't pretend to get everything right, but I do think it's important to be able, ultimately, to have a casting vote and make a decision. As far as I'm aware, no one at Canonical, if this is a career issue, has ever been fired for disagreeing with me. Not even persistently and publicly, right? That's not an invitation. Right? You know, it's a question of competence, right? And you know, there's no question I carry a lot of weight. Fine. There's no question that weight could be abused. There's also no question that I try very hard not to abuse it. And you know, I think that's that.
So we have some questions building up. So Undefined has asked the first question on IRC. How does Mark think we can attract 200 million users?
We have to be brilliant. We have to be outstanding. We have the attention of some of the world's smartest people who love and use software every day, who make software. Those are the people that everybody turns around to get a second opinion on, you know, whether something's safe, whether it's worthwhile, whether it'll be interesting, whether it'll go. I think now we have the shot. If we deliver, you know, release after release, really beautiful, strikingly usable, free software, then we will have, you know, that advocacy on our side. We're also in an unusual position in that we both have grassroots support. We also have industrial support. We have relationships with all of the world's major technology manufacturers and providers. We are a tiny minority player, but we do have those relationships. So that's why I think we're in this unique fulcrum position. There are lots of other communities doing great stuff, but Ubuntu has the eyeballs and the relationships through Canonical to carry that forward if there's market demand for it. So there we go.
So Undefined asks again, does the low-code directory collect figures and make predictions on the amount of users we have? So low-code directory, no?
No, it doesn't.
In terms of prediction around the number of users in a more general sense, do you have any comments on that?
The best indications that we have of number of users are all indirect. We have no registration or accounting facility. If we added one, we would A, get bad data, and B, turn off, you know, a big chunk of our users in the first place. So it's a dumb idea to try and, you know, track who's using what and when. But all of the indications, all of the indirect indications that we have show really fantastic levels of adoption and growth.
Okay, so New Proggy asks, is there any news about collaboration with hardware manufacturers? Because in my mind, there is no chance of reaching 200 million users if we're not able to go out and just buy a computer with Ubuntu pre-installed in it.
Okay, I mean, I think I did answer that. I think we have this shot. We have the ear of most of the world's major computer manufacturers, which is fantastic, right? It's a skeptical ear, right? They'll say, look, Linux has been around for ages. We can't sell it to users. You know, the only people who ask for it are people who don't, you know, who then, you know, won't buy that hardware because it didn't have the LED backlight, or, you know, we're all fussy about our hardware, right? The question is whether we can get beyond our own intrinsic audience, and that is why we're doing Unity. That's why we are, you know, focusing so much work on user experience, design, stability, quality, all of those things. Again, I think we should focus the questions just on the hard governance questions, okay, you know, around Ubuntu. That's what this session is about. I'm sorry for the kind of misbranding, but I don't want to get into whether we're going to do hardware or. There's lots of interesting stuff out there. Okay. This is governance that we need to talk about.
I think this one's probably relevant. UDS Logger says, every once in a while, a Muppet calls Kubuntu the blue-haired stepchild of Ubuntu. Is this actually still the case? Or do you think that Kubuntu is still an important part of the Ubuntu community?
Is it still the case that someone calls it the blue-headed stepchild? Okay. So I think the mission of Ubuntu, the archive, is to represent as much of the world's free software in a high-quality form as possible. You know, if you're a user and you really love LXDE, then we want to make sure you can get that from the Ubuntu archive in a clean elegant fashion. And we do a lot to make space for people to step up and do that work, right? And the KDE community is a wonderful community. We have great, and enthusiastic participants and supporters for that within Canonical and within the Ubuntu community. So on that basis, it has its shot. We will always, because it's in our nature to say, here is what we think is the best out-of-the-box experience if you'd express no other preferences, we will always present a face, one face or another. And that means that it'll always be possible for someone to say that some other face, which they may prefer, is somehow second class or second tier. And, I don't think it's a debate worth getting into. I think it's destructive whenever that comes up, because it makes the people who are doing the work feel demoralized, and it makes the people who are trying to make the very hard decisions of what should be the default demoralized as well. It's just not constructive.
John, I've got a sort of governance-related
Sure.
question, if you like. I know the goal is to grow the user base significantly, like we've said, and we currently have the Community Council, which is actually geared more towards our developers and contributors and things like that. Is there a goal to have sort of a user council to help grow that user base as well? Or do you think it's even needed?
I think it's a great idea, because there may well be a step beyond locos, where we have folks who are not going to be contributors, and that's okay, but in some way yet they want to be identified with and to help feed ideas and I don't want to say requirements, but certainly feed into the process. So I think that'd be a great idea, and we'd entertain it. Yeah.
Seb asked a question saying, I think Unity is getting pretty popular, and that other distros should at least be able to provide an option in their repositories, at least. Is Canonical keen to work with upstream to help other distributions provide Unity?
Again, not a governance question, but I think it's worth answering this one. Absolutely, we've taken patches and we've written patches for other distros to take Unity. We've certainly reviewed patches from folks who want Unity in other distros. I think it would be great to get Unity in other distros. The only cases I'm aware that people have started trying to do that and then got blocked was in fact on third-party upstreams like GIO and glib, where they've been slow to take patches. Or, I don't want to say slow, they're going through their process. And third-party distros, you may have an enthusiastic maintainer for packaging Unity in that environment, but he would need support from whoever's packaging those dependencies. We upstream, or we have a policy that we upstream, or at least propose upstream, all the patches in all the dependencies that we have. And there's no reason why another distro couldn't or wouldn't take it.
UC asks, what do you think are the key areas that we need to improve in our governance, from your perspective?
Daniel, you do a lot of the work around motivational and procedural work in our governance structure. There's a perennial conversation about reporting and making sure that we have clear reporting. I think another thing that we could do is, effectively training. We require quite a lot of leadership and tough decisions from people who step into leadership, but we don't provide any sort of onboarding, mentorship, training. When someone gets first appointed to a leadership council of one form or another, I don't think we take them through, the history of leadership in Ubuntu. And there's been some discussion of a summit, for example.
Absolutely. Yeah. We actually talked about this in the community roundtable today about helping our leaders to transition their experience and their knowledge to other leaders. So we built new generations of leaders as the community grows.
But in governance boards, the term length is usually around 2 years, where a lot of training happens like on the job. It happens naturally. But coming back to the question, I think sometimes we're struggling a bit when it comes to being like super responsive. The problem is that lots of people in governance bodies, they're usually the busiest people of the project, which really doesn't help. So if you need to make a really tough decision and need to get input from lots of people, it just drags on, and you're often perceived as, they're not doing anything, like they don't have anything to report, and there's quite a lot going on.
behind the scenes.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
I think good governance and leadership are different to some of the other skills that it takes to be successful in Ubuntu. You know, it's clearly not a development thing. In smaller communities, often, as you say, there's one or two highly energetic individuals, and they end up doing, you know, everything, which means they sometimes find themselves being judge and defendant. You know? And I think that's tricky. It would be useful, I think, to have a process for identifying folk who are seen as calm, clear-thinking, independent, with insight into human values, you know, how we actually get people who genuinely have different ideas to talk to each other and collaborate. That's what makes good leaders and arbiters on our councils, right? Because when an issue comes up, the only way the decision will actually be respected is if it's perceived to be grounded in good leadership and good independent judgment. That's why we have why I think it's good for us to have an IRC council, if we can, which is at some remove from the day-to-day war room, right? Because of that sort of need to ground decisions, to have widespread trust in the decisions that are taken.
So Nigel B, who was sat there, asks via the internet. There was a bit of dissatisfaction recently when an Ubuntu member was ejected. Will this process be more transparent and accountable to other Ubuntu members, at least instead of a closed doors discussion?
No, it won't, and there's a very good reason why it won't. You know, when we have hard discussions about very tough issues of personal conduct, style, and language, it is not appropriate to have all of those conversations in public. There is plenty of public commentary on somebody's behavior in a case like that, right? That is what precipitates a discussion like that. There's a fight, right? And it's a fight that is logged. So, you know, it's not as though, you know, everything's happened in secret here. But, you know, our need the need in a governance situation is to gather opinions, you know, to encourage people to speak freely, and in order to do that, some anonymity is appropriate and necessary. So I absolutely stand by the decision that was taken, A, and the process that was followed, B. Where I think we failed is I think we took too long.
Yeah.
You know, that took us how long?
About 2 months.
About 2 months. And that was after we'd already had many more months of serious engagements by community council members with the individual in question. You know, that is too long. Think how many people might have been dispirited, demoralized, disgusted, outraged, demotivated by like a long period of bad behavior. You know, we're an open community. We will get people coming in who are attracted not by the code of conduct, not by the values, not by the mission statement, but just by the fact that this is a place that, you know, there are a whole bunch of people that are going to listen to anything that they might throw into a channel. We have to guard the productivity and taste of our forums, you know, even more vociferously now. Now that could be abused. You know, that essentially says that people with authority, you know, we're giving them red cards and yellow cards and encouraging them to use it. That could be abused, but we have other ways to, you know, judge the judge. What is the expression? Watch the watchers.
Watchmen.
Yeah, watch the watchman, right? But we should not make being a watchman like unpleasant, unproductive, unfruitful. It's a job. We should get good people doing it and respect their decisions.
It seems to me, building on that, the Ubuntu community has gone through a series of evolutions as the scale has built up and we've faced different challenges, and that particular incident, it's happened so rare that we're still as a community figuring out how to handle these situations and optimize around them. Thankfully, the fact that it's so rare is a good thing.
I think, and partly I think it's rare is because we have a brand that says, you know, there's a code of conduct.
Yeah.
And that's very deep in our brand. And so I think, you know, people are nervous to come and, you know, cause trouble because they know that it's just not how we do things, and we have to defend that.
So, High Voltage, you sat there, asked via the internet, on the EMEA regional membership, we often disagree about membership for Canonical staff. Some people have, in my opinion, wrongly felt that Canonical staff should work harder to get membership, and do work outside of canonical time in order to qualify. Could we set up guidelines, even if very loose, for membership at some point to make it easier for boards and councils to grant membership?
So canonical staff should not get either preferential treatment or have to jump over higher hoops than anybody else. Absolutely, it's very easy. You know, the project and membership criteria are what they are. You know, if you're contributing for whatever we can't judge someone's motivations. You know, we can't judge whether they're doing it because God told them to, or because, you know, the voices in their head told them to, or because their heart told them to, or because canonical told them to. And you know, I think that's outside of the purview of things. If someone's making a sustained and substantial contribution, they're a member, and their voice should carry the same weight as anybody else's. I don't know. Anyone else on the CC take a different view?
To add to that, sometimes we've seen the same sort of problems with people who work for other companies to achieve something in Ubuntu. And I think that the same rules need to clearly apply there. That doesn't matter what, for fun, for pay, whoever you work for.
Right. Otherwise, we lead into a world where someone, you know, people take a job in part because they're passionate about that. Always.
Some people, yes.
And so we can't be we can't be second guessing people's motives, right? We get into it, it's just very unproductive and impossible.
So, following on from that for a second, because I think we're out of IRC questions. There's been some discussions in the past. Here's a question for you, Mark. There's been some discussions in the past about people such as canonical staff, whether the fact that they've been through 2 or 3 job interviews at Canonical should be considered in their application to be a developer, or the same could apply to Debian developers. If they're a Debian developer, how is their experience there, or packaging experience if they're a Red Hat developer? How do we feel like this would play into the assessment of them as a potential?
I'm not sure why interviewing at Canonical would just having interviewed, I don't know why that would
So there's
be
been
material.
some comments in the past about if they've interviewed at Canonical, even though it's in a private setting, they've already been through a certain amount of rigorous assessment about their engineering quality.
Right, but we don't know what that rigorous assessment determined.
No, I mean if they get the job.
All right.
Yeah.
But they may not have got the job. They may have got the job because they showed promise and interest and could learn packaging. No, I think we need to judge for something like developer, and the TB. Folks here from the TB should weigh in on this. But I think, like, to join as a Motu, as a core dev, you know, that's a bar that has to be basically proven in public. Being a Debian developer, I think, is a much stronger public signal of competence in that regard than simply having, you know, a job at Canonical, which potentially could have nothing to do with even if you're hired into the platform team. So we have platform team guys who got jobs in the platform team, but they get sponsored like everybody else until they've you know, cut their teeth. So we should use all the information we have. If someone has done a lot of RPM packaging, that's material, you know. So that's useful. We should use all the information we have.
I've got sort of a follow-up to several of the responses. And this is kind of a follow-up to my earlier question. I'll leave you alone after this, I promise. So, sort of on the same kind of thought process as the user council, maybe. Do we see a need for like an application developers council to take some of that overhead, maybe off the technical board or off of the other councils? And I wonder if the council members who are here have any thoughts on that. Because we want to grow application development for games, application development for people who use the platform. Do you think that's worthwhile to think about along these same lines as we grow these users, or do you think it's something that comes later when we have a critical need?
I mean, councils in Ubuntu have a specific role at this stage. It's their governance structures. You know, they're typically experts in a particular area of the project, and they're there to help keep that area happy and productive. You know what I mean? So that people can come here and feel like they're enjoying what they're doing. It sounds, what you're describing there sounds more like an advisory board or a representative, you know, voice. Not so much a governance thing as a advocacy, you know, the voice of developers.
Right, or just say, you know, if you're encountering issues as an application developer, who do you go to? Because we know that most of the boards that we have and most of the advisory councils and things like that have very critical mass as far as the things that they're taking care of.
Right. That sounds like a team that could report to the technical board, and I think they would take volunteers tomorrow.
Emmett, do you want to go
I
next?
just wanted to also respond that traditionally what we've done is when someone had an idea like that, they would go and do it, and if it became large, one of the existing governance bodies would interact with them to help put some structure on it other than them just being beholden to the CC.
Okay.
So some of the questions that have come up have been like canonical. Do canonical people get, do they have to, are they prejudiced or favored in a decision-making process? There are other places where I think canonical's role is contentious and worth discussing. So one of them is, for example, I think, the desktop team, which is who I think should be taking the decisions as to default apps and so on and so forth. I don't know if we have any mechanism for non-canonical folk in there. It's not a deliberate exclusion. It's just I think we need to figure that out. Is there anyone here from the canonical desktop team? Is Jason Warney? Yeah? Do we have? How would you describe the process by which that team sort of takes decisions about what should be in the default install?
I'm still learning because I'm so new to the team. So.
Okay. But clearly there are public discussions because they happen here, and we may bring things to the table. Canonical may bring things to the table, but those are.
They happen on the Ubuntu desktop list as well.
Right.
People will propose. Often, I've seen people proposing new apps for inclusion and
Team meetings.
and things like that. And
Yeah. I mean, I've often seen people say that there's a bad thing in Ubuntu because Canonical will take those decisions. I think for most of the cases that we've dealt with, there's a public track record of public discussions around default apps and so on. The Unity decision was special, and I think I hope most folk can appreciate why that was a special decision. In the end, though, there was a public discussion and challenging of the decision, and the desktop team stood by it with facts, with facts on bugs, facts on stability, crashes, and so on. And that made me very proud, you know what I mean? It would have been challenging if the desktop team had felt, no, this was the wrong thing to do, then I think that would have created a real problem. We would have probably had to revert.
It worries me that the Unity decision was special because it was the most important decision of default apps, I would say. In terms of noticeability and impact on the user experience. And so if we're going to have a system where the important decisions are not as open as the unimportant ones.
Right. I think that's fair. I think that's fair comment and a good observation. The reason I think it's special is because it was such a contentious decision that I think it would have gotten escalated no matter what. You know what I mean? And in the end, it got escalated and bounced all the way back down, redebated in public, and I think confirmed in public as well. I think that would have been a decision that could have taken a year or two to make, and that would not necessarily have been the best result for Ubuntu. So I took a view on that. It was a very difficult decision, but I feel defensible, and I'm happy to have that challenged here.
One of those kind of things?
Well, not an off with his head, one of those.
silence must be an agreement. Moving on.
I'm just curious what your thoughts as Ubuntu as an entertainment platform. I see we have a lot of good social networking apps, live streaming music apps. But I'm curious about pairing up with content providers for streaming for TV and movies, and also great presentation on wine tricks. Moving forward with gaming on Ubuntu, something like that.
Can we keep this session focused on governance, just because it's a rare opportunity to have all of these people in the room, and that's a question we can handle on
It
our
does sound
team.
like those relationships would need to be managed by some sort of governance, though.
That was weak sauce.
Which relationships?
So what I mean is, if we have this discussion with third parties and music departments and stuff, and something controversial happens, that very well could go straight up to the community council or tech board.
Give us an example.
Say a music partner starts engaging in heavy censorship practices or something like that, and we don't think those are compatible with the values of Ubuntu. how do we deal with that kind of relationship?
I don't know if it is an issue, just because Canonical or Ubuntu makes a partnership with somebody who does that. It doesn't mean that's the only place you can get that. You can still go to Amazon and have an unfettered access, or you can go, you can go to your PC and download from iTunes and transfer it to your Ubuntu machine.
Yeah, I can see an issue potentially if Canonical chose to partner with somebody that was like publicly opposed to things that are important to the Ubuntu project's values. You know what I mean? If there was a music label for racist artists, or something, you know what I mean? Something nasty, then I think can see that would be a problem, But I think if you have a relationship with a music provider, it's so that they will publish their music.
Well, maybe music's not the great, you keep saying it, but.
So,
Well, talking about this, maybe we should get onto the Banshee example, because this was controversial. This was a very difficult interaction.
Yes.
I think we made a mistake, which was not to put money on the table while this was being discussed at UDS. I thought we had. I had a corridor conversation with someone, and we just misunderstood each other. And my thing was, we must absolutely be clear about the financials, because we were already selling music through an existing, you couldn't avoid the fact that there was going to be money on the table. It got more complicated after that, because after the decision got taken, I think the Banshee community got more attached to some of those things. So, this was a mess. There's no question about that. And for that, I think we owe, Banshee community and other folk an apology. Nevertheless, it did surface what I see as a very positive policy that we have, which is that where we work with upstreams, we want those upstreams to be successful. We think services are a good way to create success, to make money with free software in a way that is much better than some of the alternatives. It's never going to be the only way. Where we can find upstreams that are interested in that, we want to promote their software, which we think will massively expand the audience of eyeballs they may get. And we want to make sure that we pass back a portion of their revenue, of that revenue. It will always be, contentious as to exactly what the levels are and ratios are. As far as I'm concerned, that's a conversation between us and the upstream. It's going to vary depending on the circumstances. There may be a lot of work involved, that we carry, or there may be a lot of work involved that someone else carries. Maybe a lot of it's in the relationships, maybe a lot of it's in the cloud and compute or something like that. It's going to vary. It's going to be essentially a commercial deal. But the principle is we should be supporting upstreams. I really worry that in the free software world, we are afraid of the idea of successful entities driving upstreams because we're afraid of giving them power. The flip side of that is, by keeping them weak, we result in we get weak code. We have to be honest with ourselves that a lot of our products, a lot of the components, apps on our desktop, cannot compete with the proprietary equivalents. And I think we have to be willing to figure out how on earth we're going to get companies to invest and build good communities and attract both the company goodness and the community goodness to make our apps better than apps on Android, on iOS, and on Windows, on Mac OS. So, to me, this is ultimately a good thing. We said very publicly, we have a model, we will share this revenue, but this is not a one-way street either way. And it got contentious, but at least that bit got clarified. Does anybody have questions about that interaction or policy around it? Or yeah.
I have a bit of a generalization. So this is about what you were talking about previously about decision making and who takes decisions. So you're talking about how in the desktop team anyone can theoretically join this team and then explain the decision making. Is this going to be different for this kind of decision? Decisions around revenue, are these going to be exclusively taken by Canonical, or is there going to be an open process around this? And is there scope for anyone else to make money from the Ubuntu product?
Mark, before you answer, could you repeat the question for the people online?
Right. So the question is, is getting into the guts of money and Ubuntu and Canonical and decision making. And I think this is really important, right? First of all, I'd say there are a lot of people who make a lot of money out of Ubuntu, right? If you think of what we facilitate in terms of deployment, in terms of employment, in terms of technology providers, solution providers that use it. It's an enormous and growing ecosystem that generates a lot of money for people other than Canonical. is completely, I think, blinkered to say, well, that the money that Canonical makes is somehow different to the money that everybody else makes. There are multiple different models. It's difficult to know how one could create a universal transparency around it because you're always dealing with commercial relationships. I think there are some things that the Community Council, for example, and Ubuntu values absolutely should weigh in on. For example, personal data, right? And the way that is handled, you know, and what policies are around personal data. I think that is an area where the values of Ubuntu kind of weigh on those commercial possibilities very, very clearly. But, you know, if we're negotiating with Sony around music, I don't know that that's something that we can create a forum for. One interesting possibility that got floated in some of these conversations was the idea of having non-canonical people under NDA, essentially, exposed to more of the discussions and decision-making processes. There are upsides to that. There are also downsides to that. On the upside, obviously, defensively then, we can say this is not, you know, that there's outside opinion getting shared. Those people would then be in a very difficult position. You know, any person who didn't like a particular decision could say that that person failed them, right? So I really don't know what we do then. I'm open to trying it. I don't know what you guys think, but
I think the other thing, just from my perspective, is one thing that money is always a contentious issue in free software, and I think one thing that, in my personal view, making money, a free software-oriented company that makes money, that's not a bug. You know, this is something that is good for free software. It's good to invest in people and products and services that help take free software further. And I think that one thing that we can probably do better as Canonical is helping to socialize that and increase the awareness around that. Because sometimes I think some of the discussions that we see are in many ways impractical. I mean, you know, people complaining about the concept of Canonical making money, but Canonical is paying so many staff to actually build Ubuntu, which helps to take free software further. So
right.
It's a sensitive topic, but what are your thoughts on that?
well, I think the idea of openness and transparency and egalitarianness and equality are very, very strong in free software and open source. Very, very strong. And to a certain extent, those easily become mixed up with the idea of an anti-company view. And I often see what are essentially anti-company or distrust of company memes mixed up with essentially transparency or freedom or openness memes. And you can understand why. And I think the reality is that the communities and projects that get those things mixed up, it becomes very difficult for companies to work with them, right? If we are able to get that right, if we're able to build a community where it's accepted that there's not just Canonical, but there will be other companies, and we want that, and we want them to be successful, we even are willing to let them try different things that other communities might get upset about, because we want to learn what works and what doesn't. Almost but not quite, no sacred cows kind of thing. Like, we're committed to freedom, but we understand that companies are going to have to participate in that, and there are going to be varieties, you know, variations on that. You know, if we can become a community that is really open and thoughtful about that, I think we will be doing the world of free software a power of good. I don't know if I'm really being clear about this, but I think that's something. We essentially have to solve that problem because we set ourselves the task of building one product with a community and a company. Nobody else does that. As far as I'm aware, everybody else says, okay, there can be a community product, and that can have one set of values, and then there's a company product, and that actually is what goes to users. And I think that disempowers the community. Strangely, communities in there sometimes feel like they're fully empowered because they can do whatever they like, but my question is, does it matter, right? Is it meaningful? We've set ourselves this very hard job of saying, okay, we want to give meaning to that, we want to give meaning to this too. And so
it seems to me as well that there is, we're still learning as our community is growing as well. I think our community is growing, Canonical is growing as part of that community, and it's important that we regularly engage with our community and gather feedback to see if we can make sure the ship's going in the right direction around things such as this, of balancing the social contract that we have with other streams and with our community, as well as generating revenue to keep this game rolling. And maybe that's something we can do every few months. Is your question relevant to Banshee?
The question is relevant to the discussion that's just happening, although not immediately to Banshee.
No, go ahead.
It is that you say we must become a community in which companies feel comfortable operating where those companies are not canonical. How do you think that, or in what ways do you think we have not achieved that yet?
I mean, clearly there are lots of companies operating in this ecosystem, and I don't think there have really been any cases where that's, become difficult between them and Canonical. Sometimes we trip over each other, and we have to kind of figure out how to work that out. That's normal, right? I guess I would go further. I sometimes see commentary on a channel, which I look at it and I say, that's prejudicial, not just to this particular company, but to companies in general. A statement like, companies can't be trusted. Well, now, if you just change the word companies in there with any minority, you'd be offended, right? You'd be offended. Most people here work for companies. Most people here, sooner or later, are going to get tarred with a brush like that. That doesn't add up. That doesn't make sense. So if we were a community which said, hold on a sec, whoa, look at all these things that companies do, and actually figured out how to do that well, that I think would actually demonstrably differentiate us from take us closer to where I think free software needs to be in order to be really, really successful. For example, like Enterprise DB work with Postgres. It's under a BSD license. They have their own version of it. It has some secret sauce in it. There are people in the free software community who could fill up many column inches with why that's wrong. Right? In our community, I would say, that's fantastic. Why aren't there two of them? Right? They can compete. They can try different models. They can contribute code that is interesting in different areas. They can differentiate themselves. More users will be happy. It's absolutely clear. If you talk to Linus Torvalds about this, for example, he says there's no such thing as a freeloader. There are people who start out thinking they're freeloaders, and then you get engaged, and you can't help but doing good along the way. That should be our philosophy, I think. Right? I think that's wise. It's not shallow. I find a lot of the commentary on this elsewhere in free software very shallow. Companies bad. Libertarian, or like individuals good. Well, you can only do so much good as an individual. You can change the world. You can make a revolution, but you can't run a country, right? And we need to be able to be serious about free software, and that requires wisdom.
So you kind of gone and said, well, okay, previously open source was the best way to be involved with Ubuntu. Now closed source is welcome as well. So it's kind of an exception for companies, I guess.
No.
Now, with the case of, say, like private data, what if a company comes and says, well, we have no problem with selling your private data? How are you going to, I guess, defend against that within Ubuntu?
So no, it's not as though we've said open source is great and now closed source is okay too. For example, we had a good public conversation about whether we should, check the box that installs Flash and so on by default. We decided not to. I think that was very good. So it would be wrong to characterize this as a shit. But what I'm saying is I think as a community we should be more sensitive to the fact that when someone comes along and expresses prejudicial opinions about companies that are pursuing something like a BSD code base or copyright assignment. For me this is clear. I know I have to make that case more publicly, but for me this is absolutely clear. Or advertising on websites or web services, like the GeoIP guys or so on and so forth. We will see, for example, front-end clients to software, to back-end web services where, what if someone did an open source GTK app front-end to Google Docs? Now, in some communities, that would be an excuse for vast amounts of flameage and debate and unproductive stuff. And here, I would hope we would say, you know what? That's interesting. Is the client free software? It can go in Ubuntu. You know what I mean? Or is there a free software version of it? Okay. How can we help that play out? We're competing with, not with ourselves, right? We're competing with Apple and Microsoft. Let's go fight that battle. And I don't think there's a shift in position the way you're characterizing it.
Right. I'd say building on top of that, one thing I like about Ubuntu is that we trust that our users can make their own decisions about how they apply their ethics to software. But we provide as much choice as we can provide. So, there's some people in this room will not use any non-free software, including kernel blobs or anything like that. And some people, such as myself, are more flexible, generally run a free software operating system, but sometimes might use Skype or things. And I think we each draw our line in the sand in different ways. And I think it's important that we empower all users to make those choices and to not make the choices on behalf of them. And part of that is not forcing closed source software on people. So
It's now Microsoft Skype. So you're going to be running.
Skype's still awesome. Any more questions related to Banshee or that particular topic? Because I've got a couple of extra ones in the can.
I have a question, but it seems like it's very sensitive, if you don't mind. So currently, as you know, there are some misunderstanding between our Canonical and GNOME community. So people still have this kind of understanding that the Ubuntu or Canonical totally abandoned the GNOME and starting to use Qt instead. So my question is how to get back to them, and how can we avoid this kind of misunderstanding?
I think it's a great question, and it is a sensitive subject, and it is an important issue. GNOME as a community is very, very important in free software. And it's certainly been very, very important. Our relationship with GNOME has been very important, and historically has been a very good one. It's not as though that has been a easy relationship throughout and then suddenly become an impossible relationship. Every single cycle, there will be patches in Ubuntu against a GNOME package, and there will be someone else who has an opinion about those patches, and that gets turned into an Ubuntu versus GNOME. It became, it was a very significant issue when we adopted Unity, but it's always been an issue, and it will always be an issue. Every single distro, Fedora, patches GNOME in some cases much more heavily than Ubuntu does, and there are numbers to back that up. Every single distro does that. It's in the nature of, software that gets released first and then second. You know what I mean? Software that got released second typically carries some patches, and so there's always, that's always been a slightly tricky issue. Looking forward, a couple of things are true. I hope that GNOME users feel that they can get GNOME from Ubuntu.com, in a format that's defensively great. We've always done various things like that. We had the GNOME Stracciatella session, which really tried to say, okay, let's separate out the changes that that are made in Ubuntu from those that, let's try and make that more visible. Whatever happens, I hope that GNOME will always be well represented in the Ubuntu archives, just like you could expect it to be represented in the Debian archives or anywhere else. There is something of a change within GNOME itself, where it's not even clear if that is a change. GNOME has historically been kind of a platform, and there are lots of things on top of GNOME that sometimes overlapped with each other, but broadly speaking, lots of people thought of that all as one broad GNOME family. When we began the work with Unity, it was absolutely clear to us that, in fact, we made conscious technology decisions so that we could be on that platform and part of that platform. And when I talk to a lot of GNOME developers today, a lot of them will say, well, this is easy, you know what I mean? It's GNOME is like that, and Unity is part of that, and that's straightforward. However, there's another voice within GNOME which became much louder in the last short period, which says that no, GNOME shouldn't be like that. GNOME should be one product which is defined in one place, and it's up to GNOME to decide how deep that definition goes. Problem is that essentially means that if that view carries the day, then Unity and GNOME are different. By one view, it's all one, it's all one environment. By another view, they're different. We have asked the GNOME Foundation board to give a view on this, and so far what we hear back is there are different opinions, right? To a certain extent, we can continue like that, because to a certain extent, life is ambiguity, and it's okay. And there are people, who think of themselves as GNOME, people who think of Unity as GNOME, and there are people who think the other way, and we think one way, and so be it. That ambiguity makes life a little uncomfortable, because it means it gives someone permission to say, I'm not going to look at that patch, and you can see this. We're not going to take that patch in GTK because it's not needed for GNOME Shell. well, what about LXCE? What about XFCE? What about these other things? Well, we'll tolerate them. We'll tolerate Unity, but GTK serves GNOME Shell. That's one view, and there are people saying we're not going to look at that patch because it's not needed for GNOME Shell or because it's different to what's going on in GNOME Shell. By another view, no, GTK is, or any GNOME thing should be open to all of those stuff. And it makes conversations very difficult because you can't point to a policy and say, that's actually not the correct opinion, or that is the correct opinion. It just happens to be the opinion of whoever's in charge of that particular piece. I don't know how this plays out. I do know that it was very uncomfortable for us to start to see that narrowing of the GNOME product definition, because it clearly can only lead to one thing, which is that Unity is something different, which is not a place that we set out to be. And so I don't know if I'm giving you a great answer here. I know it's uncomfortable. I think, but if one view in GNOME carries the day, then the discomfort eases. If another view carries the day, then we have to find a way to work together, respecting GNOME's decisions. I very much respect many people in GNOME, but I also know that you have to respect your differences. So if the GNOME view is that they want one thing and our view is that we want another thing, that doesn't make anybody bad, right? We'll just have to figure that out.
Go ahead.
You're not going to just read it.
I figured you're here, so. Just read it. Okay. Yossi asks, how do you think we can improve interactions between different governance boards and councils, especially where their areas overlap?
So what would be examples of overlapping?
Local channels on IRC.
That's a good example.
Or forums channels on IRC.
Forums channels on IRC.
We have a channel, Ubuntu forums, Ubuntu forums, for example.
And saying people should work together calmly and collaboratively would not help solve the problem.
No. I think, in that kind of case, so in the case of forum channels in IRC, that the IRC Council would be the overarching governance about this, but hopefully the IRC Council would take advice, especially if it's about the people involved, since maybe the Forum Council would know these people better. So it would just be a matter of communication between the Forums Council and IRC Council, and we both have mailing lists, and we both know each other, and so it shouldn't be no big deal.
There's also a team council's mailing list that we're all on, so maybe using that more.
Yeah.
And maybe
We should
defining.
use that more.
Yeah.
Yes, really
We should
should
all.
use that more.
All right, so that's been decided. Action item, George would be happy.
Yeah, I think that's a good view. That the media governance is what carries the day.
And also we're going to have a governance roundtable here at UDS.
Good. I haven't seen that.
Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, one thing I run across often is now and again almost every day in UDS so far, someone says, but that decision has been sabdl, and then someone else comes in and said, yeah, told you so, knew this would happen. And then I think, well, it's a big decision if sabdl makes a decision, so it's probably logged somewhere. Then I do Google and look for mailing lists, and I can't find that specific that decision logged anywhere. I can't easily find where it was made. So I was wondering if it might be a good idea to log a bug report for sabdl decisions, or make a wiki page.
Sure.
Then people could.
Sure. Some of those may become
log
celebrity
concerns
bugs. I may unsubscribe from some of them. But yeah, I think that would be absolutely just as a way of just confirming a position one way or the other. Sure.
And then there's also a lot of concerns and risks.
I think that's absolutely fine. Yeah.
Anti-bug mark.
Yeah. Look, I get a lot of credit for things that I didn't do, which I try to reflect back on the people who did. And I sometimes get the blame for stuff that I didn't do either.
Right. So that's why I check.
And decisions are binding only until they're changed. It would not be a good idea to vacillate. It would also not be a good idea to be completely inflexible. And I understand that. So there's a long list of good history of decisions that I've improved on upon having better facts.
There's a concern that I've heard that sometimes decisions are thought to be marked decisions, but then the language that comes from them is, we at some mysterious team, or not, if it was absolutely clear when a decision was a Mark decision versus a decision that came from a team versus a decision that came from the whole project, like it would calm a lot of people.
I mean, the best example of that is the buttons decision, right? At the end of the day, there are different views. I took a view that was slightly different to any of the other views, right? But it was much closer to some of the views than other of the views, and it was different for a reason, based on things that I know that, I happen to know. At the end of the day, it was a decision. It's somewhat prejudicial to sort of taint a decision by just the fact that it's the one that I agree with, or it's the one that I proposed.
What I mean is, if it was not attributed to a decision-making body when it was, in fact, ultimately your decision.
I'd say in Mark's defense, certainly from my experience of working with Mark, is that it's never like Mark ever says, we're doing this. There's always a discussion, and some of that discussion may not be a public discussion, it may be with a selected group of people, that maybe community members, but there's always a discussion. So the decision is never, I think the fear is maybe that the decision is uninformed. It's just, I'm Mark Shuttleworth, this is what we're doing. Whereas I don't think that ever happens.
Look, I really do shoot for benevolence.
I think it's also important to say that in many cases where there's been a very contentious decision, Mark's done a very good job of indicating when it's a Mark decision and when it's a dictator decision. And that's an important distinction.
There's a distinction between Mark and dictator? Just teasing.
It's a shirt.
One involves animal choices, and the other involves.
So,
Not animals.
this session is ended, but there was one final question. If you can tend to this really quickly, is do you have any thoughts about areas in which governance should be expanded outside of the current councils? Is there any areas that you think we need to apply further governance?
Geez, the people who have best visibility on that are people who can see areas which are don't feel productive or don't feel happy. You know what I mean?
No, I just asked the question.
So if we see, the community council, if we see something like that, we try and act to fix it. There's no question about that. If I thought there was an area like that, we'd be doing something about it. But we could well be, it's a huge community, we could well be missing something, and I would ask you if you feel like there are areas which are which aren't on rails, right? Then we'll help you get that together.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mark.
Thank you, guys. I just want to say thank you to the folk who step up to leadership responsibilities in Ubuntu. It's a big responsibility, and you carry it off very well. Thank you.
John. Yeah.